Before I start, Lagim Fam, I would like to request you to perhaps join me in a minute of silence dedicated to the victims of the ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza, Palestine. After writing about Kian de los Santos for a previous episode, I found it hard to cover yet another murder of a young person at the hand of the Philippine National Police, or PNP. I could not find the heart to do it because these are horrible cases, to say the least. The war on drugs should technically be over with the end of Duterte's reign of terror, but we all know that it was never really about the drugs, and so it will never be quite over unless this president and any next president takes a strong stance against police corruption and brutality. The war on drugs did show us one important thing. Just like its American cousin from the 70s, the war on drugs was and is a war on minorities and, most importantly, the poor. It is not like huge, rich drug kingpins were ever gunned down at Forbes Park or BGC, let alone prosecuted in the 6 years under Duterte, right? What the killings under Duterte's presidency also revealed is our increasing apathy towards its victims. Let us be honest with ourselves. Unless you grew up in the poor conditions these poor victims grew up in, you probably have not cared about them when they were still alive, and so you may have found it hard to care about them in death as well. When they are murdered, we look and then look away. Just another body in the gutter. Some of us may even say what Patricia Evangelista named her new book after. Some of them need killing. We seem to be okay with their deaths. When I was thinking of covering today's case, I stumbled upon a threads by one of my favorites on Insta and Threads. The account name is dating_Pilipinas2. And the statement said the following, quote, "Every death in the drug war has had the same unfortunate fate of having been born to a culture, a community that needs their ending to be entertaining, exploitable before anything resembling empathy could be extended in protest or even vote. Without the dramatic content to consume, their fate of being born a statistic gets sealed." End of quote. We are all guilty of this. Yes, us all of us. So what do? We have to demand change. Stand up for those who are on the margins, and we do not wait until the streets are drenched in blood again in order to see these kababayans as humans, deserving of human rights, due diligence, due process, respect, and empathy. This is the case of Jemboy Baltazar. Mabuhay Lagim Fam, welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. After being on hiatus for almost 2 months, I think I am hopefully back. I say hopeful because you just never know with life and its curveballs, right? I know that in the past weeks, I have been posting heavily about Palestine, and this is going to continue, just for your information. I have lost loads of followers because of this. I've received the odd comment or DM here and there, but the Lagim fam is largely supportive and willing to learn about what is happening. I have gained some new followers as well, so it is nice to see that too. For those who are new to the podcast, welcome. And for those who have been sticking by Lagim from day one, thanks, and I truly appreciate it. Without further ado, let us start with this episode. As always, details in this case might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. They were after a shooter or a robber, and the suspicion was that this shooter was somewhere in Navotas. Their intel told them that their man was involved in a village shooting, and after escaping, he hopped into a boat on the Navotas River, probably to escape. So on the 2nd of August 2023, a Wednesday, members of the Philippine National Police headed over to Barangay NBBS Kaunlaran, Navotas City. It was around 1:30 in the afternoon when they arrived. Immediately, their presence raised suspicions and the neighborhood's level of anxiety. After all, in the Philippines and elsewhere, the police are not known to really protect and serve the poor and marginalized. In a lot of places around the world, including the Philippines, the police have been known to be rather anti-poor, and that is putting it mildly. As the police made it to the river, one boy felt rattled at the sight of the authorities. He had nothing to fear though, but since the police are not trusted in these parts, it was perhaps a reflex that made the boy feel nervous to the point that he felt the need to jump into the river and swim away as quickly as possible from the police. He left his friend in the boat, and that would have been it were it not for the police's reaction to the boy's actions. When they spotted him swimming away, they opened fire. The boy was hit and was now hurt, still in the water. Now remember, this is the story the police offered to us in the aftermath of this shooting. Now around 30 minutes later, the boy's family arrived, having heard of the shooting. His family members wanted to get near to him. Maybe they could still save him, but the police refused to let them do anything. This standoff lasted around 3 hours, after which a relative dared to defy the police orders and jumped into the water to recover the now lifeless body of the boy from the boat. His body had been in the water for 3 hours, and as you can probably already imagine, any efforts that could have helped with treating his gunshot wounds would then have been completely useless already. When the boy was recovered, he was dragged onto a makeshift boat where his father held him. The boy's sister captured this sorrowful scene on video, and this was the first image of this case that was launched into social media, making sure that Filipinos, both abroad and in the homeland, paid attention to another case of the police killing a child. Jemboy's family stayed by the river and had to wait for the PNP scene of the crime operatives, or SOCO, until that very evening. After they finally arrived much later, Jemboy's remains were finally released to a funeral home at 10 p.m. to make sure said remains were ready for an autopsy. Now, just to reiterate, the details I just mentioned earlier were some of the first ones we would learn about in the immediate aftermath of the shooting of 17-year-old Jerhode Jemboy Baltazar. But as in most cases, nothing really was as it seemed that mournful day in Navotas. The coverage of Jemboy's death quickly focused on the why he was shot, so much so that we do not really get a lot of details as to who the young 17-year-old was. What we do know is that he used to be in school and dreamt of working as a seaman after his studies. But life was hard and money was tight, so Jemboy dropped out just before he could finish 10th grade. He then worked as a fisherman in order to help provide for his family. It made sense. His home is surrounded by water after all, the Navotas River to the east and North Breakwater to the west. Jemboy's father stayed with him and his siblings at home, whilst his mother worked in Qatar like so many of our kababayans who want to build a better life for their families by looking for work abroad. And this was one of the painful things we would learn about this case. Jemboy's mother having to come home to a family that was now completely grief-stricken and a son that was no more. But aside from grief, there was, above all, anger. We would learn from Jemboy's sister that the version I told you as to how Jemboy died earlier was the police's version of what happened, and it did not, according to her, reflect the gruesome truth as to how her brother died. According to Jemboy's sister, Jessa, her brother never jumped into the water before the shooting started. According to her, the police had supposedly fired a warning shot into the water whilst Jemboy and his friend were still in their boat. Jemboy at this point felt like he needed to jump into the water, but his friend stopped him, reminding him that there's no point. They are innocent and not guilty of anything after all. However, afterwards, without any further warning, the police started to indiscriminately fire shot after shot at the two boys. Jemboy, it would seem, attempted to jump into the water again, but he did not get that far. He was hit by a bullet first and then fell into the water. The rain of gunshots continued, and by sheer luck, Jemboy's friend was not hit and survived this awful ordeal. Jessa would add later that her brother was hit in the back of his neck, and the bullet that hit him exited through the boy's nose. He was also supposedly hit in his hand. Whilst this already painted a very different and more incriminating picture for the police, on the day that Jemboy was killed, the police concluded and announced that Jemboy was not their target. He was not the target of their operation after all. The 17-year-old boy was not the shooter they were looking for. And when this became clear, all hell broke loose. The media, the public, and politicians quickly weighed in on what happened after Jemboy's killing. A case of mistaken identity? Surely not. And so, uncovering all the details of what happened that day, especially because of the differing accounts given by the PNP and Jemboy's family, was essential. The first thing that needed to happen was an autopsy. The autopsy of Jemboy's death did not happen right away. Dr. Raquel Fortun, who I have mentioned a few times in the past already, and who also did the post-mortem examination on Kian de los Santos, started her examination of Jemboy's remains on the 5th of August, almost 3 days after Jemboy was killed. During this time, and whilst we were waiting for the results of Dr. Fortun's post-mortem examination, we would also learn some more details about Jemboy's killing. Remember I told you how Jemboy's body was submerged in water for 3 hours and how his family was prevented from taking him out and how they had to wait until the late hours of August 2nd in order for his remains to be taken away? Well, it had become clear that the police's rationale for stopping Jemboy's family from approaching the river was that they wanted to wait until Jemboy's body floated back up to the surface. What was weird, though, was that the police then left before this could happen, and only then could one of Jemboy's relatives recover Jemboy's body from the river. The Baltazar family was at this point accusing the police of not only shooting Jemboy for no reason, but also of negligence for failing to recover him in the hope that he could still be rescued and treated for his injuries. On the 7th of August, Jemboy's body was returned to his family, allowing them to finally make funeral arrangements. The photos from the wake of young Jemboy were heartbreaking, and it shows the depth of grief within a family who could not quite believe their sudden loss. 2 days later, on the 9th of August, was the first time really that we've heard any substantial action taken against the police officers involved in this shooting. There were 6 in total, and by this time they had been relieved and were all detained at the police station they once worked in. They were later transferred to a bigger facility. Navotas Police Chief Colonel Alan Umipig told the public that all 6 had undergone inquest proceedings before the Navotas City Prosecutor's Office and that the Baltazar family had decided to, understandably, file a homicide complaint against all 6 officers. After being asked who these police officers were, Umipig refused to reveal any of their names, a gesture that was not appreciated by the public, as it gave the appearance that Umipig was perhaps protecting the privacy and identity of his fellow police officers when all the public wanted was accountability. At this point, we were heading into week 2 after Jemboy's killing. So far, the PNP appeared to be doing relatively well in appeasing the public by showing that they were truly prioritizing his case. But as we entered day 8, 9, and the next days of week 2, some things were set to upset the public again, and more importantly, the Baltazar family. As we headed into August 10th, we would learn that 2 ground commanders plus the 6 police officers who were involved in the shooting were looking at an administrative case filed against them. On top of this, we were initially told that homicide charges were filed against the officers as well, but this was not the whole story. There were homicide charges against the 6 police officers initially, but these were ultimately downgraded to the lesser charge of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide and not just homicide, the former of which carries with it a lesser prison term of up to 4 years and 2 months only. Just for comparison, a sentence from a homicide conviction can carry up to 20 years of prison time. Meanwhile, Umipig, in a rare show of regret and remorse by the PNP, admitted that the PNP had committed a mistake. According to him, there was no intention to kill Jemboy, but he maintained the first version of the story I shared earlier. He even added that a warning shout was given to Jemboy and his friend, but Jemboy still jumped. The police officers then opened fire, thinking their quote-unquote suspect was trying to escape, and according to Umipig, the police officers only shot at the water, therefore unintentionally and unknowingly hitting Jemboy whilst he was already swimming away. Now, let me hit a pause here because I have a few bones to pick with this story anyway, and some other things that have been not sitting right with me. Firstly, isn't it a bit odd and counterproductive to shoot at an escaping suspect if your goal is to question or prosecute him later? Why would you shoot someone who is not attacking you anyway? Aren't the police taught that the only time they should and must shoot suspects is when the lives of other people and their own lives are in danger? A person who is seen as escaping a scene on a boat, defenseless and without a weapon, does not exactly fit that bill, right? Secondly, how on earth is it in line with your goal as a police force to get to the bottom of a case by leaving a dead body in the water instead of recovering said body ASAP to confirm that you have indeed got your guy? To then wait for over 3 hours and then leave is even more puzzling, if not downright counterproductive yet again. Lastly, who decided the charges? Of course, I may appear naive when I say that if this were a fair system, then the initial charge should have stayed as homicide. However, this is not a fair system, so here we are. Nevertheless, knowing that the backlash from this case was fairly quick and huge immediately, I think it would have been prudent for the prosecutor's office to stay with a homicide charge and then present their case to the court, who could then decide whether said charge was warranted. Alas, this was not the case, and soon enough, political figures like Senator Risa Ontiveros expressed their disappointment in the lesser charge being filed against the perpetrators, blaming the culture of violence and impunity within the PNP and the entire government as the ultimate reason for Jemboy's death. And as for me, it is hard to disagree with that. Whilst all of this was happening, bear in mind that Jemboy's mother, who had known of her son's brutal killing for more than a week, was still in Qatar, having to grieve over her son's death on her own. There were some strong feelings over this, and I believe that pressure was applied on the government to show a good faith gesture towards the Baltazar family somehow. As a response, the DMW, or Department of Migrant Workers, decided to shoulder Rodalisa Baltazar's travel costs so that she could travel home immediately. The DMW also added that they would give her 100,000 pesos as a way to help her shoulder Jemboy's funeral expenses. On the 11th of August, Rodalisa was back in the country and headed home to Navotas to finally see the remains of her son. Again, in the age of social media, everything is documented, and that includes these very delicate and heartbreaking moments of a mother coming home, exhausted and profoundly sad, unable to even touch her son in the casket. The pictures are unbearably heartbreaking, and I think the public, especially the netizens, felt this sadness and became even more invested in the case, constantly drawing comparisons with Kian de los Santos' case. Inevitably, this also meant mounting pressure on the PNP. Umipig knew this. As a response, 27 cops were relieved from their posts, and Umipig also promised that these officers would undergo seminars and refreshers on standard operating procedures and the rules of engagement. Over at the Commission on Human Rights, strong words were issued condemning the killing of young Jemboy. The CHR also announced that since they have a mandate to initiate probes into any alleged abuses committed by the government. Their probe had been ongoing since the news about Jemboy first broke out. Human rights watchdog Karapatan was more severe in their condemnation of the PNP's actions by essentially saying that claiming Jemboy's killing was a case of mistaken identity was a, quote, flimsy excuse when the police should have exercised due diligence in the identification of suspects they are after. They should in fact exercise due diligence in every police operation, end of quote. In another part of their statement, they then said, quote, these killings continue because it remains part of the police's orientations and mindset to kill, kill, kill. End of quote. I personally find it again hard to disagree with these sentiments given what we all have seen in the past 6 to 8 years, and with the killings continuing even after the Duterte administration. With all eyes on the PNP at this point, Dr. Fortune's findings, which came out on the 11th of August this year, did not help the PNP's case. They further attempted to whitewash their narrative of what happened to young Jemboy. Dr. Fortune found that Jemboy died of, quote, craniocerebral injuries due to perforating gunshot of the head, with asphyxia from drowning as contributory cause, end of quote. She concluded that Jemboy's killing was a homicide because if he had not fallen into the water and was left there, he would have had a chance of surviving because the brain injuries were not immediately fatal. She continued to state that she found a gunshot wound in one of Jemboy's hands, pointing to an attempt to perhaps defend himself. This corroborated what Jemboy's sister had said already a week prior. Dr. Fortune also found the neck wound that Jemboy's sister Jessa described. This was the wound, you might recall, that was caused by a bullet that entered Jemboy's neck and exited through his nose, causing the brain injury. As it stood, nothing about Dr. Fortune's findings supported the PNP's version of the story. This was probably the reason why 2 days after these results were made public by Dr. Fortune, she rang the alarm after PNP members from Navotas visited her to demand the autopsy report from her. I think on the surface, this might not look concerning, but such things should be done formally and not through a random surprise visit. The autopsy was requested by Jemboy's family, and unless there was a court order or permission from the family to share the autopsy report with the PNP, they had no business paying Dr. Fortune a visit when they could have requested access to the report through email or other formal ways. Now, Umipig did claim that they sent a letter to her, so if that is the case, why visit her? It reeks of an attempt to intimidate her and perhaps make her change her conclusion. Obviously, it did not work. The additional negative backlash the PNP received from the Dr. Fortune issue was easily trumped by some new information that came out on the 14th of August. As it turned out, none of the 6 police officers had their body cameras on during their operation in Navotas, which I found rather odd. Since they said they were in hot pursuit of an escaping shooting suspect, you would think that they should have had their cameras on already anyway, or at least turned them on once they were in Navotas looking for their suspect. How convenient that none of them had the cameras on, making it even harder to prove who fired the first shots at Jemboy. In an effort to explain this away, I think, Umipig said that this was not the first time that body cameras were not turned on during operations. I do not think this had the damage controlling effect Umipig thought it would have. In fact, this sort of made things worse and further affected the confidence and trust Filipinos have in the police. I think in an effort to perhaps truly damage the whole situation this time, the PNP finally released the names of all 6 officers involved in Jemboy's killing, but then tides turned yet again against the PNP when on the 15th of August, PNP Internal Affairs Service Inspector General Alfegar Triambulo ordered the relief of and the filing of an administrative charge against Umipig for trying to manipulate PNP reports in relation to Jemboy's death. More to this later. This was utterly devastating to hear. But Jemboy's family could not focus on that too much because on the 16th of August, Jemboy was finally laid to rest at the La Loma Cemetery in Caloocan City. He was buried on the same day as Kian de los Santos' 6th death anniversary. A sad and bitter reminder that in 6 years, things had barely changed and the lives of young people are still very much endangered. In the second week after Jemboy's death, the PNP showed itself very much willing to take responsibility. Despite Umipig's attempt to doctor some police reports in favor of police officers involved in the Baltazar case, and the revelation that none of the 6 officers had their cameras on during the operation, the PNP constantly reiterated that they admitted they made procedural mistakes in the Baltazar case. They said they were going to review their own operating procedures. Interior Secretary Benhur Abalos even said, quote, "We will revisit all of their modes of procedure and take up the doctrine of command responsibility to see up to what level of officers should be held accountable. This should never happen again." End of quote. Navotas police officials added that they also wanted to determine why such mistakes like the killing of Jemboy could occur. They called it a lapse of judgment, and they themselves admitted that it needed looking at, seeing as 2 years ago, they implemented new policies on the use of force after the Duterte administration ended. I guess what rubs me the wrong way about these very remorseful statements is that they just never ring true, given the police's actions that we see every day and the level of corruption that we also witness on the daily. The PNP in this case seems to say all the right things, but you and I have this nagging feeling that this was and is all lip service somehow. We know that using force should be a last resort for police officers and not a means to catch their suspects. The PNP PR machine also tells us this. It is like preaching to the choir, and yet we see time and time again the reality of a lot of Filipinos, especially those living in utter poverty, who seem to always be in the firing line of a lot of police officers. It does not help either that for every remorseful statement made on a certain day, the next day we would hear another version of one aspect of the story the PNP had told us in relation to Jemboy's death. On the 14th of August, for example, the PNP clarified that yes, the body cams were off, something they already admitted to earlier that week, but they were only off because, well, they ran out of batteries. Things like this are extremely frustrating because instead of truly putting their money where their mouths are, the PNP seemingly was still trying to subtly minimize their culpability and mitigate any future consequences. If you ask me, if the battery story was accurate, then it would be still reckless of the police to not properly charge their body cams or substitute their batteries to make sure that these cameras stay on for the duration of all their operations during their shifts. If this is not possible because of the quality of the cameras, it would still be on the PNP to procure body cams that can serve their purpose properly. I mean, what good is all that tax money for if we're only getting substandard tech, right? All I'm saying is that no matter what excuse the police come up with regards to body cams not being worn during operations, it will never be on the Filipinos to answer for that negligence and incompetence. We do not owe the police understanding and forgiveness for not doing their jobs properly. You might remember how I mentioned that Umipig was relieved of his position and was facing administrative charges for doctoring a report. I just wanted to circle back to that because it is this little kink in the story that kind of shows how much the PNP, at least in the early days of this case, said all the right things but were in fact working very hard in the background to cover up for some of their colleagues. In Umipik's case, it specifically came to light that he instructed one team leader of the operatives involved in the shooting to exclude 11 further officers from being mentioned in an important report. One can only guess why, but this further eroded the minimal trust the Baltazar family and the public had in the police at that time. With this new development, more officers were relieved of their posts and then reassigned to the Regional Holding and Accounting Section of the National Capital Police Office. Umipik specifically was also facing complaints of dishonesty and command responsibility, plus the administrative charges that I've already mentioned. Now, towards the end of August, the Philippine Senate finally commenced their own probe into Jemboy's killing, something that Senator Risa Ontiveros and Senate Minority Leader Aquilino Pimentel III spearheaded very early on after Jemboy was killed. On the first day of the probe, and as expected, lots of emphasis was placed on two things. Firstly, the lack of justification for the use of firearms in the Navotas operation, and secondly, the manual of procedures followed by the PNP. Focusing on these two premises was a good start into these proceedings, but soon enough, the public saw that some of the police officers who were the subject of this very probe were not really feeling cooperative. Two officers were quickly held in contempt after the senators, for example, were trying to determine who amongst them shot first and what they had seen or what they did before the shooting started. They did not get the answers they were hoping for. One suspect denied seeing Jemboy after he jumped or fell into the water, and one of them flat out refused to answer questions. By the second day of the probe, the senators were talking about how the current neuropsychiatric exam that new police officers go through must be looked at and perhaps amended. This exam is part of the screening process, and I do get the sentiment that specifically Senator Tulfo and Senator De La Rosa were expressing during this part in the Senate probe, but this aspect is just a tiny one in a system that is inherently problematic, corrupt, anti-poor, and trigger-happy. Reforming this small aspect and several other small aspects will not make a dent in this institution that is problematic to its very core. In a Washington Post article from 2021, almost a year after the George Floyd murder in the US, the following was said of the cycle of demanding reform and outrage towards the police. Quote, "The legacies of these firsts reveal the difficulty of remaking law enforcement. At each agency, the attempts have been stifled by entrenched cultures, systemic dysfunction, shifts in leadership, and swings in public mood. Outrage at officers' conduct eventually gives way to demands for aggressive enforcement when crime flares, and the cycle continues." End of quote. This is all too real and applicable in the Philippines as well. As much as we see and detest corrupt and illegal police actions and practices, we do get to a point where we want things to change, and for the police to be more strict, perhaps. That is how Duterte's war on drugs resonated loudly with a lot of Filipinos who have seen drug-related activities and the effects of illegal drugs on people, especially the young ones. Suddenly, lots of us were willing to ignore breaches of human rights and civil liberties just to see the drug problem go. But the problem with that is the war on drugs never really addressed the root cause of the problem, which is poverty, corruption, and bad governance. And it never went after the big fishes either within the drug dealing industry. Instead, small-time pushers and users from poor communities who needed financial help, mental health, and rehabilitation help were arrested, imprisoned, and/or killed instead. But on the surface, some Filipinos thought that Duterte and his minions of trigger-happy policemen were really cleaning up the streets of drug problems when all those 6 years caused were hurt, trauma, and no change in our country's drug problem. So we are currently at a point where we have seen the brutalities and we have seen that nothing has changed, and our focus has now shifted yet again to police violence. We do not want it. We find it deplorable. Our opinions have changed from the time of Duterte. We shame the police, put pressure on them and our elected officials, and we demand change. But what will happen when the cycle moves forward and we see yet another societal ill that we want the police to ruthlessly address? Will we be back at a place where we are willing to let go of human decency in exchange for a dirty Harry regime? Perhaps, perhaps not. One thing is for sure. A police reform is not effective unless you address the core issues of our society and the core issues of the police as an institution itself. When you hear others say defund the police or abolish the police, that is what they are fighting for. They want to tear down the whole system and build it back up differently because reforms will never suffice. They are band-aid solutions. A new neuropsych exam as part of the screening test will at some point not be enough to weed out the bad ones from the PNP. A newly reviewed operations manual for the use of lethal force will at some point ring hollow for police officers in the Philippines, and a newly appointed chief of this and that department will just put the next corrupt official in. So when I hear senators focus on such details as the neuropsych test instead of talking about systemic issues, it genuinely deflates my soul because this is not the kind of conversation we should be having in order to save the lives of the likes of Jemboy and his peers. My previous point, I think, was best demonstrated 18 days after Jemboy was killed. On the 20th of August, John Ace Ompad was on a motorcycle with his 15-year-old brother John Frances Ompad. Police officer Arnulfo Sabilio stopped the duo at a checkpoint as John Ace was supposedly drunk whilst driving. The young man, however, refused to stop and instead kept on driving whilst also throwing his helmet at Sabilio, who was at this point pursuing the brothers. The police officer inexplicably drew his weapon and aimed at John Frances. He fired and hit John Ace instead. The 15-year-old later died at a hospital. Yes, John Frances acted foolish for drinking and driving and having a passenger with him. Yes, he was stupid for not stopping. And yes, he was stupid for throwing a helmet at a police officer. But let me ask you this. What was the reason for drawing a firearm and shooting at two people who were not threatening the police officer? Why was lethal force used when Sabilio was clearly not in danger? The Ompads were heading away from the police officer, who, by the way, was not in his uniform, which was against PNP operational procedures for manning checkpoints. Sabilio, for all we know, could have passed all the tests with flying colors and understood all manual operations in theory. But if he had already assimilated in himself the belief that he stood above the rest of us, that he had power, and that his gun was an extension of that power, if he had understood and internalized that he could potentially get away with shooting at a couple of poor kids, if he saw the poor, the vulnerable, or a couple of naughty juveniles as less than human, no amount of screening tests and manuals could change that behavior. The problem sits deeper than all of that. Now let's go back to a few more details we would learn about Jemboy's killing during the Senate probe. By the end of August, we would learn more about Jemboy's killing from the perpetrator's perspective during the Senate hearing, and to be honest, they did not do themselves any favors. Reports from August 29th detailed how the police officers said that they were merely panicking, and this is the reason why they fired at Jemboy despite there being no order from their own team leader to do so. They called it panic firing. One of the 6 police officers said that moments before they opened fire, he heard gunshots near the area. He ended up being the first one to open fire. He is Police Sergeant Jerry Maliban, and he said when he opened fire, he shot into the water. He further said that this first shot was meant to warn a Reynaldo Bolivar, the real target of their operation that day in Navotas. Maliban said, quote, "Self-preservation lang po ito. Ang iniisip ko po nung panahon na yun ay may pamilya rin po kami. It was just self-preservation. What I was thinking of at that time was that we also have our own families." End of quote. Again, I want to ask the same question I've already asked, but perhaps in a more specific and more detailed way this time. If it is a clear day at 2 in the afternoon and your supposed suspect is in a boat and not aiming anything at you, how can you say it was self-preservation? There was no visible and imminent threat. What were you exactly panicking about? Now, 2 other police officers said that they too only fired warning shots into the water, essentially telling us that no one, at least at that point in the Senate investigation, wanted to admit to actually firing the fatal shot at Jemboy. Now, another crucial thing that came out of the Senate hearing at the end of August was the fact that the police did not follow their own procedures whenever officers deployed their guns in an operation. From what I understood, both a ballistic and a paraffin examination are standard and mandatory. Whilst the former was conducted, the latter was disregarded despite orders from Umipig before he was relieved of his post. This again goes to the heart of the issue of trust in the police. How could the Navotas police officers be certain who fired their guns during that awful operation when no paraffin tests were conducted? If the police do not know this because they could not be bothered to follow their own procedures, how can we be sure who to specifically hold accountable for a death like Jemboy's, and how can we learn to trust the police again? Needless to say, the Senate's attempt to get all the answers in relation to how the 6 police officers proceeded on the day that Jemboy was shot was not a walk in the park. One police officer, the one who was complicit in the paraffin test issue, was caught in so many lies and was afterwards held in contempt. But despite these startling obstacles within the Senate hearing, a few good things did come out that helped paint a clearer picture of what had happened that day and the days after Jemboy's killing. By August 30th, 2023, the friend who was with Jemboy in the boat was finally questioned by the Senate. His name is Sonny Boy Agustillo. According to him, after he and Jemboy got into the boat, they heard the first few shots coming from the 6 police officers. At this point, both Jemboy and Sonny Boy, according to this young man, were just getting ready to sail out and were therefore cleaning their boat for their journey ahead. Sonny Boy, as he told the Senate later, specifically saw Police Sergeant Jerry Maliban point the gun at them and yell at them to get out of the boat and water. As they started to comply, the shooting resumed. That was when Jemboy felt the need to escape and jump, but he never got to this point as he was hit by potentially at least 2 bullets that eventually killed him. Sonny Boy confirmed that at no point were they given any warning or reason for being shot at. He would also add that after the shooting, he was brought into the police station and physically assaulted. One police officer punched the side of his body 3 times before he was supposed to give his statement, making this assault look like an intimidating tactic of sorts. Sonny Boy was verbally threatened also by Jerry Maliban, the police officer who is said to have been the first one who fired at Jemboy on August 2nd. Maliban allegedly also forced him to confess that he knew the perpetrators of the robberies in their area, potentially the same people who the police were originally looking for. Maliban told Sonny Boy that if he did not confess, his parents would not be able to find him, hinting at a plan to kill Sonny Boy and probably hide his body where no one could find it. Sonny Boy's revelation did not stop there. According to him, the police wanted to make it appear as if Jemboy had illegal drugs and a gun with him. Another police officer by the name of Police Captain Mark Joseph Carpio attempted to force Sonny Boy to include these details in his affidavit. Carpio supposedly told him that he needed to include these untrue details about his friend in order for some of the involved police officers to be able to keep their jobs. Carpio still denies this to this very day. Sonny Boy, in his testimony, also denied that warning shots were aimed at the water. He said that right from the get-go, the shots were fired at him and Jemboy without warning. After Jemboy fell into the water, according to Sonny Boy, the police continued to shoot. Carpio denies this, saying that the shooting stopped and that he asked Sonny Boy to surrender. If you cannot already tell, Sonny Boy's contribution to this Senate hearing was extremely vital, and his testimony, along with the testimony of others, led to some pretty big developments in this case as we entered September 2023. As the Senate hearing was still commencing back in August, both Jemboy's family and at least one human rights organization filed murder complaints against the involved police officers. But ultimately, the goal was to get the prosecution of Navotas to file the same charges in order to finally pave the way for a trial. By mid-September, there was still no indication that this was going to happen, but what did happen was that the 6 police officers and their 2 team leaders were finally dismissed from service for showing grave irregularity in the performance of their duties and for demonstrating conduct unbecoming of a police officer. As for the other 20-plus police officers who were also considered part of the botched operation in Navotas, it was recommended that they would be suspended for at least 59 days. This recommendation was accepted, leading to the suspension of the police officers involved. As I understand it, this dismissal is currently being appealed by the same police officers. Finally, by the start of October this year, the city prosecutor of Navotas formally filed a case of murder against the 6 police officers who were directly involved in Jemboy's killing. Based on the charge sheet, the 6 officers are accused of conspiring to kill Jemboy when they fired successive shots at the young teenager, thereby inflicting gunshots to the back of his head and hand. The prosecution at this point was ready to present 7 witnesses, which include Dr. Raquel Fortun. Following this development, an arrest warrant was released for the 6 police officers on October 3rd. Since they were already under restrictive custody of the PNP because of their reckless imprudence resulting in homicide complaint against them, they were merely moved to a local jail under the auspices of the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology after the arrest warrant was released by the allocated court. This court did not recommend any bail, which means that the 6 police officers will be staying in custody until trial starts. Now, just to be clear, the previous charge of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide is still there, but an additional murder complaint was filed as well. Now, despite being in custody already, the 6 police officers formally surrendered themselves to authorities in Quezon Province. They went through the normal booking procedures and documentation. Obviously, the Commission on Human Rights welcomed this development, as indeed it was a long time coming, and Jemboy's family deserved to finally see movement in this monumental case. Meanwhile, the National Bureau of Investigation was ordered to provide protection to and secure Jemboy's family, as they could be at risk of retribution now that the case is finally heading to court. Whilst it is great to see that this case seems to be progressing rather quickly and in the right direction, we still do not know if the court will be able to hear this case as soon as possible. What we do not want to see is this case languishing in the Filipino court system, just like so many cases we have discussed on this podcast already. There's one thing I do want to highlight before I ultimately end this episode. During the Senate hearing, we heard the likes of Senator De La Rosa admitting that his former organization, the PNP, had failed despite recent reforms. Despite an increase in basic pay in the hope to eliminate corruption through the culture of bribery, it would seem that corruption in general is still a problem. Is he really surprised? As I said earlier, the problem in every police institution is systemic and goes deeper than bribes, lack of basic pay, neuropsych tests, and basic training. I hope the likes of Bato de la Rosa will come to see and admit this, because despite the Senate's good job in uncovering what went wrong in Navotas, the killings continue. The legacy of Duterte's war on drugs and the culture of impunity persist. The current administration has so far been passive and invisible in tackling this issue head-on. Meanwhile, the police continue to be confidently trigger-happy, and the poor remain the most victimized. Unless the police problem is addressed at its very core, we will be seeing more Jemboys and more Kians out there losing their lives before they could even reach their prime and full potential. I want to end this episode with this audio from a video of Jemboy's mother. May we all remember the words and the tears of this grieving mother who lost her son way too soon.
Sana po, mabigyan po ng hustisya yung anak ko sa ginawa nila sa anak ko. Hindi nila binigyan ng pagkakataon. Pinabayaan nilang nila sa ilog ng 3 oras. Hindi mo lang nila hinahanap kung ano nangyari. Tapos pinabayaan pa nila na nakaano lang po sa styro ng 5 oras bago dumating yung soko. Ano po sa at tingin nila sa anak ko? Ano lang po, pusa o aso na binaril lang nila, pinabayaan lang nila doon. Tao po yung anak ko.
Lagim fam, thanks so much for listening to today's episode. Thanks for the support and above all, thanks for your patience. As always, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you do, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it helps me and my podcast become more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes below for all the links to my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next time, thank you lagim fam. Daghang salamat, maraming salamat, at mabuhay.